Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. And I appreciate everybody's flexibility given the change in the schedule. But we are really excited to have our Secretary of Energy here, Dr. Steven Chu. And I know that this is his first visit to the laboratory ever, so we've got a lot to show him in a short amount of time. And I know we've been looking forward to this visit for quite some time. And you know, I've had the opportunity to interact with Dr. Chu on a number of occasions before he became Secretary of Energy. And we're quite interested in not only his vision, but his passion for the challenges in energy. And I've seen this firsthand, and we're excited to have him here sharing his vision, sharing his passion. It'll be evident when he talks, I'm sure. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Weiss. But before I do that, I think we should all just welcome Dr. Chu with a round of applause.
Welcome, everyone, and I'm glad that you have this opportunity to share some time with our distinguished Secretary of Energy. It's clear, you can tell he's a hands-on secretary. He's working through this little technical glitch with the same passion and focus that he works through everything that we have him focused on for the Department of Energy's mission. I don't want to take up any more of his time. I know that he is excited to be here. We're all here, sir, ready to give you a rundown of the lab in the time that we're given, and we want to welcome you on behalf of the DOE office here and the laboratory in a partnership focused on getting the mission accomplished. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our Secretary, Dr. Steven Chu.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for having to reboot the computer, but it seems to work now. Anyway, I'm here to talk about a number of things, but let me just begin. It's primarily about the energy challenge, but before I begin, let me just say that the Department of Energy has many vital missions. National security. I understand that's one of your primary things, is a non-proliferation part of our national security. We have to clean up our nuclear Cold War legacy, and we have to do the science and engineering that can solve this energy challenge. So what is the energy challenge? Well, I think our future economic prosperity is going to be intimately tied to how well and how efficiently we can use energy, and how we can generate newer carbon-free sources of energy. There's a potential for geopolitical conflict due to the escalating competition for energy resources. We see this played out weekly, monthly basis in many, many aspects of this. And finally, there's the new 800-pound gorilla in the room, is the risk of adverse climate change. In the New York Times this last Sunday, the Department of Defense released a report, no surprise really, but as one looks towards potentially significant changes in the climate, that could have real destabilizing influences. Nation states teetering on the edge of viability could collapse. This is spawning ground for all sorts of things, terrorist activities, whatever. And so this is something that would also work in these issues. Now, so those are some reasons for getting moving, but let me say that there are a lot of positive reasons for going. And that is to say, let's imagine a world 10, 20 years from today. It's safe to bet, although we don't know what's going to happen to the price of oil next month, next year, even 5 years from now, 10 and 20 years from now, it's almost assuredly going to go up. If you look at the production of conventional oil, if you look at the increased demand from oil, especially in the developing countries, we will have to go to more unconventional sources of oil, as we are beginning to do today. This is tarry oil, tar sands oil. This is deep offshore oil. So you can bank on it. The price of oil 20 years from today will make $70 a barrel look inexpensive. The other thing is that we will live in a carbon-constrained world. I hope we'll live in a carbon-constrained world a few years from now, but 10 and 20 years from now, we will be there. It has become very obvious, especially in the last decade, that the climate's changing, that humans caused it, the primary part of it, and it's becoming more obvious that if we go and continue as business as usual path, the consequences would be horrific. So let's take those as two givens. So let me remind you of when Wayne Gretzky was asked why he was such a good hockey player, being a skinny little guy, relative to hockey players. He said, well, I position myself on the ice. And how do you position yourself on the ice? And he says, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. And so this is where the puck is going to be. Higher oil prices, increased competition for it, a carbon-constrained economy. So the United States has an opportunity to be the leader in this new industrial revolution. Or it can hope that we were back in 1950. And 1950, I'm picking 1950 because that was actually the year we began to import oil. So I should have picked 1949. We were still exporting oil then. And we were on the top of the pile industrially. We came out of World War II in flying colors. So here we are, dependent on foreign oil. This blue line is our consumption of oil. That little downtick is the recession. And this is our production of oil, peaking in around 1970, slowly declining. Even with the great oil in Alaska, it has been slowly declining. So that's where we are, and we are now spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year importing over 60% of our oil. In the clean energy race, that is to say, in the areas where countries will be vying for high technologies in clean energy, this is just one, photovoltaics. Here we are in green. That's the U.S. shipments of solar photovoltaics. Red is Japan. Europe is brown, and blue is the rest of the world. But this is just one example. If you look at all the other energy technologies, automobile fuel efficiency, very efficient 6- and 8-speed transmissions that are not fluid torque converters, but almost like dry pad transmissions, we're behind. Batteries, 99% of all the batteries that are going to be used for automobiles will be imported into the United States when we start to go into plug-in hybrids. Electricity transmission. We're no longer leaders in electricity transmission and distribution, even though it was Edison and GE and Westinghouse that were really the developers of this technology. That has gone to Europe, to companies like ABB and Siemens, and now China wants to be a leader and take it away from Europe. The United States is nowhere to be seen. Power electronics, similarly. I was on the National Academy of Sciences Engineering panel called America's Energy Future until President Obama asked me to take a new job, so I had to resign off that panel. But I put myself on two subcommittees as well. It was a 2-year study. One was on advanced fuels, like biofuels, and the other was on electricity transmission and distribution. And it was startling to realize how far behind we were, in part because of our industry. In fact, one ABB representative said the American utility industry would come to them and say, you see this transformer we had, it just blew out. It's 50 years old, it served us well. Can I have another one? He said, we don't make that model anymore. We can get you a lot better, a lot cheaper. No, I want this one. Even if it costs double, make me that one. Okay? Kind of scary. Nuclear power, just go down the list. And we have, one by one, ceded the leadership position in all of these technologies. IPCC. Believe it or not, in the town of Washington, D.C., there are people who still believe that the globe is not warming up. They say, well, in recent years, it's actually been cooling off. What is all this climate change hocus pocus? So there you can clearly see that it's been cooling off. If you look at these error bars, you could say for the last 5 years it's plateaued, but you shouldn't ever get excited about any 5-year or even 10-year thing. Because, for example, if you look at that one, it really was cooling off. And look at that one, it's increasing. The moral of the story is something that's happening over a 5-year, 10-year period, you're not really sure. But something happening over a 150-year period is very different. Okay. So the temperature has been warming up. There have been consequences, and many of the people at PNNL have contributed to the wonderful fourth assessment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But let me remind many of you in the audience who have not been paying that close attention, at least most recently. This, for example, is the polar ice cap in the month of September where the meltback is strongest, the most. And here on the upper left-hand side, you see that this is the 1979 to 2005 average, and this is what we have in 2007. This are the observations of the polar ice cap. This was the IPCC model prediction, and this is the 90% confidence level that that's what would happen. And so what we're seeing, and we're trying to still fully understand this, but the polar ice cap is melting faster than we thought 10 years ago. So that's of some concern. Global sea level rise. Past 2,000 years, based on indirect evidence, the sea level relative to all the average of the continents, because continents drift around, they go up, they go down, but the average over all the continents is essentially flat. In 1870, direct tidal measurements were being made, and it was a very slow creeping up of 0.6 millimeters a year. By 1990, 2008, it has gone up fivefold. The rise in sea level is also beginning to exceed the 90% confidence level of what we thought was going to be happening. Partly, most of the sea level rise is due to the fact the oceans are simply getting warmer and it's thermal expansion. But there's something else. The glaciers of the world are melting. And this is the cumulative melt of the glaciers from 1960 to 2000. We've now lost over 2,000 cubic miles of glacier around the world. And as you see, you can look at the first and second slopes. It's increasing. So again, this is a little bit alarming, or a lot alarming. This is a record of the carbon dioxide over the last 800,000 years. And again, this is Antarctica data. And this actually mimics the temperature change. So for example, in periods like here and here, there are ice ages. In periods like here, we're now in a warm period as well. They're relatively warm periods. The periodicity is actually due to astronomical reasons. The magnitude we don't fully understand, but the very complex dynamics, Newtonian dynamics of our planet, the change in the eccentricity of the orbit, but mostly the tilt. If the axis of the rotation of the Earth is more or less tilted as you go from winter to summer, depending on northern southern hemisphere, you have more time to build up ice. The point I'm trying to make is that here we are today in the carbon dioxide level. It's off to scale of the last 800,000 years. In fact, it's off to scale of the last 1 to 2 million years. Now, there was a time 50 million years ago when the Earth was considerably warmer, but it was a very different Earth. Let me try to convince you how different that is. Between where we are today and this ice age, the average temperature, roughly 6 degrees centigrade different. That's all. And so 6 degrees centigrade colder world meant Canada, United States, down to Ohio, Pennsylvania, covered year-round in a glacier. We have, depending on which one you look at, the IPC, MIT, more recent MIT report, various probabilities. If we continue on a business-as-usual scenario, where will we be? IPCC says if you look at their probability distribution, there's a 50% or greater chance we'll be above 4.5 degrees centigrade. MIT says 5 degrees. Okay, an equally different world on the other side, as business as usual. And that's why it's so important to get off the dime. In the low emissions scenario, the low emissions is the Kyoto 550 parts per million. We'll be up here, and the high emissions we're up here. So we're really off the scale of the last couple of million years. And so we don't really know what's going to happen in great detail. Most climate scientists say there's about 1 degree centigrade to go warming, even if we stop all carbon emissions. It's very easy to fundamentally understand the basic reason why. You've just put a layer of greenhouse gases up there. We're not in equilibrium, so the sun is coming down, continuing to heat up the planet. But it's going to take a while for the temperature of the planet to increase before the infrared radiation reaches equilibrium. And the amount of infrared radiation escaping through the greenhouse gas layer is equal to the incoming radiation. Why is it going to take a while? It's going to take about 100 years. It's because the deep oceans haven't warmed up yet. And it will take about 100 years for the oceans to warm up, and then you know what your equilibrium temperature is. This is very hard for many people to understand, that what we have done so far, we will see only in 100 years. If we continue to do what we're doing in the next 10 or 20 years, we bet that much more of a debt into what will happen 100 years from today. Okay. Oh, so you're in Washington, so I thought I'd show you what would happen to some places in Washington. In red, 4 feet, those places go underwater. The pink, it's 2 feet. This is what's going to happen, the chance of fertile land becoming desert around the world. For example, here, this is the Great Sahara Desert, so you can, red is bad news, yellow is semi-bad news, green is okay. Guess what? That's the United States. Not good. In the early, middle 1930s, there was a slight change in weather for about a decade. There was also bad agricultural practices, but it was in large part due to a change in weather. And suddenly, the fertile Midwest of the United States became a desert. This might be forever, or at least for a couple hundred years. Okay? Again, in Washington, this is now not the end of this century, but this is in the early part of this century, 2020, 2040, where you begin to see pink and red. Those are the temperatures in which the salmon begin to be endangered. Salmon do well when the outside surface temperature, average surface temperature in the summer is less than 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but when it gets up over that, you don't find salmon there. So the Great Columbia River Basin and all those other areas will be threatened, not by the end of this century where you see the full effects of what we've already done, but even by 2040. And then finally, there are tipping points. There are a couple of tipping points. Let me just describe one. It turns out there's a lot of frozen organic debris in the northern latitudes, in Russia, Canada, Alaska. What happens is when vegetation grows, it grows pretty slowly, but when it falls down and dies, the microbes are essentially frozen in permafrost. And so what has been happening over thousands and thousands of years is this organic debris is not being recycled by the microbes. It's just piling up. And what happens is if that permafrost, that permanently frozen earth, does thaw, the microbes will wake up and they will begin to recycle this organic debris. It will cause it to rot, release a lot of methane, carbon dioxide. The amount of carbon in the frozen tundra, big error bars, we don't know for sure, but it can be more than twice the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today. And so what happens is as the microbes warm up, they cause the methane, carbon dioxide to be released, more greenhouse gases, more warming, and you get a runaway effect. So that's what's called the tipping point. It's nonlinear, and it feeds on itself. Similarly, the great ice sheets, particularly in Greenland, it's 2 to 3 kilometers thick. It's colder 2 or 3 kilometers higher than down below. As it begins to melt, it accelerates because it's just plain warmer. Once you reach land, the sun keeps that land warm. So these are tipping points. The IPCC predictions don't include any of these tipping points. Okay? Because it was considered somewhat speculative, and as they're preparing for the 5th assessment, they're beginning to rethink whether you should at least begin to include these tipping points. We don't actually know what temperature this is going to key in on, whether it's 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees. But that's why many of the climate scientists are saying 550 is too high. It's got to be 450. Because we're getting, if there's a 20% or 30% probability of getting to this tipping point, then the show is over. I would say, we reach a tipping point, enjoy life like, on the Titanic, that string quartet, the glass of champagne. Okay, anyway, but it's not too late. And we can save it, and we can seize this economic opportunity, because we will need a new industrial revolution to have abundant sources of energy, but make it clean energy. And so the first thing is to use energy more wisely. There's a very recent report McKinsey has put out in the last couple of weeks that says fundamentally you can make great strides in cutting emissions by simply increasing the energy efficiency. So you say, well, it's going to cost money. Can we really do this? They say, no, no, no. We can reduce the primary consumption of energy by 26% by 2020, but the only time we are allowed to do this is if we make money on it. And what does make money on it? Let's say you have money, $10,000 for your home to weatherize it. And you're going to discount the value of that because you could have used that $10,000, bought CDs, or made some other money some other way, and waited for technology to get better. So there's a way of formally discounting that in this so-called net present value methodology. They chose 7% per year. That means after 20 years of that investment, let's say today, it's only going to be worth 26% of that investment 20 years from today. So it's a very sensible business way, a hardcore business end of saying we're not going to make an investment to feel good, we're going to make an investment, will you save money? And so what they say is, yeah, you'll save about $680 billion, well exceed the Waxman-Markey target of 2020. Okay? So let me give you one example. It started in California. It's now throughout the whole nation. This is a plot of the energy use of per refrigerator. And refrigerators over the years, since the middle 1970s, have gotten much more efficient. It's now, they use approximately 1/4 of the energy they used to use in the middle 1970s. The size of each refrigerator went up. It used to be 18 cubic feet. It's now 22 cubic feet, still increasing because the American appetite's not sated. The size of the kitchen door is being taxed. And so that's the determining factor of the size of a refrigerator. And they've solved that because they're making them wider. And the new homes have slots in the kitchens that are wider. So don't fear, you can have a bigger refrigerator. Now, the point here is that what about the cost of refrigerators? The inflation-adjusted cost of refrigerators went down by a factor of 2. A better insulated refrigerator means a smaller compressor, means a more efficient unit. So efficiency does not necessarily mean added cost. In fact, it should really mean I'm no longer throwing away money. Oh, by the way, you think refrigerators, how much energy do we save? If we had all of today's refrigerators at 1975 efficiencies, we'd be using more energy, additional energy, than all the renewable power in the United States generated today, excluding hydro. So that's about 3% of our electricity. We save more on refrigerators than all the wind and solar and geothermal. That's how important efficiency is. Now, many of the roofs in our infrastructure are dark. I'm not sure why, dark, tarry things, blacktop warehouses. But if you have a white roof, you can actually reflect a lot of that sunlight heat back into space. That's good. People in warmer half of the United States are finding that they can reduce their air conditioning bills by up to 20%. So that's saving money. That also means less carbon dioxide. For those of you who think that white is ugly, I picked 2 examples, especially Centauri, Greece. But there's something else. In addition to saving yourself money, and by the way, you can go to local hardware stores or get a contractor, and you don't have to wait to replace your roof. You can actually get a coating that slops on your roof that will save in your air conditioning bills. But there's something else, and that is Art Rosenfeld, now the Energy Commissioner California, state of California, and some of his colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley Lab did a little calculation. If you put on white roofs or light-colored roofs and light-colored pavement, light-colored means cement instead of black top, the sunlight gets reflected back into space. It doesn't get converted to heat that gets trapped by the greenhouse gases. And that would be the equivalent of taking all the automobiles in the world, about 1 billion cars, off the road for 11 years. Okay? So this is a very mild form of geoengineering. Again, it costs, it's better than free. Now, going to more high technology building efficiencies, it turns out that we sometimes don't really know what we're doing. Now, why do I say this? I don't want to insult any building engineers here. But so you just do this by looking at the LEED certified buildings, either gold, silver, platinum, or just plain certified. You get a LEED certification by the design, not the performance. But when you actually build the building and see how it's run, and admittedly, there's some things in the LEED certification that have nothing to do with energy efficiency. You know, if you put a few bike racks, you get some points, things like that. But most of it is energy efficiency. Now, on the x-axis is the design end use intensity. And so to the right means the building is using more energy. To the left means it's using less energy. And you notice there's a huge spectrum. It goes from 20 to 140, a factor of 7 in energy per square foot, for example. Now, this is a ratio actual to design. So 1 means the building meets design standards. Worse than 1 means it doesn't meet design standards. Better 1 exceeds design standards. So if you don't really care about energy efficiency, you're actually pretty good. Meets design standards, but you didn't really care. Now, if you work really hard and try to go to gold and platinum, you notice platinum is down here, and see they're scattered. You can't even tell which is gold, which is platinum, and which is silver. But fundamentally, as you push down to more and more efficient designs, it goes way above. The performance is poor by about a factor of 2. Okay? So just a simple graph says, we have something to learn about designing energy efficient buildings. So what do we have to learn? Well, let me propose there's a better way to design buildings. You can have a computer program that tells the architect, the structural engineer, the people designing the building, any changes you make. It actually has embedded energy analysis, and it guides them in making more efficient buildings, passive shading, all those good things. And you can make a change in the design, and this computer program tells you what it's going to do to the performance of the building. This sounds like space-age stuff. Not really. This is the way we design commercial aircraft now. It is a massive computer program that keeps track of all changes and tells you what the performance of the airplane will be, what's how much fuel consumption will have, and so on. Now, after you've built this high-tech building with very exotic building control systems, you may also know that the people hired to run the buildings may not be able to deal with these very sophisticated integral proportional controllers and things of that nature. I know this from firsthand experience because when I was at Berkeley Lab, I was given a new laboratory for my personal research, and the people in this building couldn't program the HVAC systems for those rooms were specifically designed for temperature stability. In the second basement, I had one of the suite of those rooms. And it was oscillating back and forth by 9 degrees Fahrenheit. It would go like this. Okay? And in fact, it was so bad that we couldn't take any measurements for several months. Finally, I said, look, let's have a meeting. I asked the people, what kind of heating ventilation? Is it integral proportional? They didn't know what that meant. But in the end, they let me have access to the code that controlled our rooms. Okay, 3 days later, we got it to work a factor of 2 better than specs by simply programming it correctly. Now, okay, but you know, not everybody's going to be able to do that. In fact, when I told my postdoc, he said, I don't know anything about HVAC. He said, you know about feedback. I tell you, it's oscillating like this. Just put the set point here, and it's going to oscillate like that. That's a heaviside function. You've got the response curve. We'll go to town. So, oh, okay. Now, if I said that's the heaviside function to the guys in facilities, they're going to look at me, okay? Okay. Or the Green's function, okay? So what we want is we want a computer to run the building. This is a set of computers that runs a Ford. And so what it does is it senses the oxygen, the air temperature, the pressure, the engine temperature, the throttle position, and knock. And it constantly adjusts the timing and the fuel mix to optimize the performance of the engine, get the most gas mileage. You can get 30% more mileage with today's modern engines because there's a very smart computer that's monitoring on a second-to-second basis what should be going on with your car engine. And similarly, we can do this with buildings. Okay? So these are technologies that exist, and they're robust. Planes don't fall out of the sky. Your car continues to work while you're driving. Okay? And we need a robust system. Okay? We want to deploy low-carbon technologies we have today. Here's an example of a great low-carbon technology. It's a great wind turbine. This is a huge one, and the price of wind generation has gone down by an order of magnitude or more. This one happens to be 6 megawatts. The rotors are 126-meter diameter. Just to give you a better feel for how big these rotors are, this is the biggest commercial plane in the sky now. It's a 747-400. Its entire wingspan is less than one of those blades. They're also an engineering marvel. You can do a very simple calculation. You've got a slug of mass of moving air. It's got some kinetic energy. Here's your wind turbine. It's got to pass through, and it's got to have a continuous, continuity of stuff going back in. So it's conservation of momentum, continuity of the air. Those are the only assumptions you need, and you say, what's the best you can do with only those restrictions? And it is actually a very simple, suitable for a graduate physics oral exam. And it's called the Betz limit. It's a fraction, 16/27, and it says you can extract 59% of the kinetic energy. These turbines extract 50%. Okay, I leave it as a simple exercise to figure out how 3 skinny little blades can get most of the energy out. So this is good, but we need a better transmission distribution system, and it's going to take a couple of decades to grow this in the United States. I went to China 3 weeks ago. China has now started a 800 kilovolt, plus or minus 800 kilovolt DC line. They can move energy 1,900 kilometers, about 5% energy loss with this DC line. We can move it 190 miles with 10% energy loss. It's a little frightening. They have a megavolt AC line, and they're integrating this DC to. And so I asked them, well, why are they doing this? This is not cheap, because they're a front leader. This exceeds anything in Europe as well. Said, our renewables are in the western part of China. That's where our wind, that's where our sun is. And we've got to get it over the eastern part where the people are. Sounds familiar. Okay? Except, so then I asked, well, gee, that's pretty expensive to do all this. What about your ratepayers? What do they say? And the person who is the head of the state grid is this large publicly owned company said, well, of course people don't really like the idea of us taking money from their pockets, but we explain to them how important it is. Difference between China and the United States. Every leader from Premier Wen on down that I talked to, everyone said climate change is a real issue. Business as usual for China and for the world will be devastating. We've got to do something about it. The carbon emission and the increase in carbon emission in China is unsustainable both for us and for the world. That's a very big sea change from even 3 years ago. And so they're gearing this up, and they're gearing up renewables, they're gearing up cleaner energy for their own consumption. It's not all for export. Okay, so now President Obama and Congress has said in the part of the Recovery Act, we're investing $4 billion in the smart grid. Their transmission loan guarantees and WAP and BPA have a total of $6.5 billion in borrowing authority. I'm pleased to announce today that the McNary-John Day transmission line under the BPA, Stephen Wright is here somewhere. Hi. Due to largely his efforts and his diligence, we've gotten this going close to the speed of light. That's a private little joke between us. That we are getting this thing going as quickly as possible, and it's going to be very good. Also, BPA is beginning to look very seriously at pumped storage. BPA gets 20% of its power from wind, the rest from hydro. And this has great opportunity because there are hydroelectric resources in this area. And so when the wind is blowing and you don't want it, you can use that energy to pump water up a hill. And when you need it, you can let it go down from one dam to another dam, for example. The overall round-trip efficiency of pumped storage is anywhere between 70 to 85% efficient. And it's massive amounts of power. And so when you go above 20% and 40%, you need massive amounts of power storage, and the Pacific Northwest is actually very good at this. PNNL has been very good about some demonstration experiments looking at demand response. This is a graph of the generation and distribution assets of our country and how much they're used. So for example, if you go 50% of the time, this is the generation, this is the distribution, you're only using all the stuff, for example, in generation, about 70%, distribution, even less than 50%. The rest of the time it's essentially idle. The worst part of it is up here as these things go zooming up. So in those few rare moments, 5% of the time, that's 440 hours, if you could shift the peak load away from that last 5%, don't run your dishwasher during this time, back off in your air conditioner during these hot summer days, you're talking about reducing the amount of generating capacity and distribution capacity by a significant amount, more than 10 and 25% respectively. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in savings, which means lower power bills. It means a greater return on investment for power generators and distributors. And so that's why the smart grid is so, one of the reasons, one of several reasons why the smart grid is so necessary, because it will enable the consumers and the power companies to start playing these games of saying, on the peak times, shift the load to less peak times. You don't have to build another power station. You use what you have more effectively. But there are more things. In fact, we think we can get a 20% load reduction, but it needs more than just a smart grid. You need to decouple the profits of utility companies from selling more energy, because right now there's a perverse incentive. You want to get a bigger return on your investment. Well, actually, you're limited in your return on your investment. If you want to make more money, you try to sell more energy. And what really matters is the return on your investment. And so decoupling means that utility companies are left whole for the return on their investments. But if properly decoupled, they become the biggest advocates for energy conservation, demand response, pricing programs, smart grid. These are the things that we need. Very briefly, nuclear fission. We are trying to start it up again. It can be made much safer than before, passively safe, natural circulation. There are some issues, but I believe the nuclear waste issue is solvable. There is a more important nuclear proliferation issue that's of concern, but and that would require international cooperation, but again, solvable. So this is baseload power. It's going to take a while to get renewables around the country because of the transient nature. And so this is clean baseload power. All right. Finally, and this is where PNNL and other national labs come in, and universities, we need to discover breakthroughs. This is a solar learning curve. Started from 1980 to 2009 is about where my cursor is today. It's a Moore's Law curve, and one is marching down to $1 per watt of the module. Right now, the modules are being sold for $2 a watt. It's about $4 a watt for including the balance of system cost. For bigger installations, it costs more than that just for your rooftop. And hopefully, if we can figure out how to get it down to about $1 total installed cost per watt on a rooftop, then people will start putting these things up without thinking. So that's a goal, and it's possible, but it's, you know, we need some more breakthroughs. Transportation. There is a reason why gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, kerosene is so good. It's because if you look at the energy density, either in energy per unit volume or energy per unit weight, this is pretty high on, good is up here, okay? So here we are, diesel fuel, gasoline, kerosene, body fat. There's a reason why nature decides in mammals to store fuel in body fat and not in carbohydrates. Okay, it's not a fashion statement. It's because it's the highest density. Oil is the highest density. Look where look where the lithium-ion battery is today. It's so close to zero, it's hard to distinguish it. So these are the numbers. However, if we get a battery, and it doesn't have to be that good, it only has to be down there, that would be a good enough battery so that you can go about 300 miles on a single charge. And so it needs 5,000 deep discharges. That's about 15 years, the life of a car. And if you have this, it's good enough because an electric motor is a lot lighter and smaller than an internal combustion engine. And so that's a challenge. It's got to be a factor of 5 better. I think the next generation batteries in a couple of years, I expect it to be a factor of 2 better, but the cost has to come way down as well. Let me, a little quiz for you. What does a Boeing 777 have to do or have in common with a bar-tailed godwit? So what's a bar-tailed godwit, you ask? Bar-tailed godwit is a little bird. It's about this big. Okay? What this bird does, and I, for the life of me, don't know why, but it migrates from Alaska to New Zealand every year and back. It migrates either nonstop or sometimes it stops off in China for a little refueling. And so both can fly nonstop for 11,000 kilometers, roughly 7,000 miles. So this bird can fly 7,000 miles without refueling. I don't know when it sleeps, but maybe it sleeps on autopilot. The 777 takes off, and 45% of its takeoff weight is jet fuel. When this bar-tailed godwit takes off, 55% of its weight is body fat. It lands one skinny bird. Okay. Okay, so transportation fuel is very, very high-density stuff, but we still have to solve this problem. For personal transportation, trucks, trains, different issues. We've got to also figure out how to use coal cleanly. It's going to take a while, hopefully 10 years or less. Why do we have to do this? Well, US, China, Russia, and India have 2/3 of the coal supplies in the world. Even if the United States turns its back on coal, you can be guaranteed China and India will not. And so I think it's very important for the developed countries to take a leadership role in trying to figure out how to use this and capture 90-95% of the carbon dioxide in an economically feasible way. Finally, the United States has great agricultural potential, unless the climate changes significantly. Here's some grasses. It's called miscanthus. This grass grows. This happened to grow in an unirrigated, unfertilized field outside the University of Illinois. You mow the grass down in the autumn time, and it springs. It's a perennial, so it springs back up, and you get similar growth the next year. Based on the yield in this particular field, it's 15 times more ethanol per acre than corn. But it costs more to break this stuff down and turn it into ethanol. But if you can figure out how to do this, and you can turn the agricultural waste, like wheat straw, corn cobs, half the corn silver, the rest of it you have to plow back in, the grasses like this that grow like weeds, you can get perhaps all of U.S. gasoline consumption off onto biofuels and make more sense than what we're doing today. So this is a target. What we at Department of Energy want to do is we want to lay the seeds for transformational technology. So let me remind you of an example of a transformational technology. When AT&T was building the first transcontinental telephone, this was actually in 1914, they had an essential invention. It was a vacuum tube. That vacuum tube was an electronic amplifier that allowed you to talk across the country. The trouble, for those younger people in the audience, that's what a vacuum tube looks like. The trouble with those vacuum tubes is it requires that you heat up a wire to red hot so electrons come out, and then you modulate how many electrons get collected in a plate. So here's your wire, here's your plate, they stream out, a little grid in front. Works great, except it burns out. And so a lot of the engineering expertise of AT&T in the teens and 20s and even the 30s were being spent making vacuum tubes last 1 year, 2 years. They got up to 6 years. That's pretty good. A vacuum tube will last 6 years, because when I was a kid, the vacuum tubes lasted about 1 year. You had to take all the tubes to the hardware store, test them, put in the good ones. So, again, you younger people don't have a clue as to what I'm talking about. Transistors never burn out. And so what happened is AT&T Bell Labs, because of an invention of a fantastic new theory in 1925 called quantum mechanics, by the middle 1930s, the physicists at AT&T said, maybe This theory is good enough that we can actually understand how electrons move in semiconductors, so we can invent a solid-state vacuum tube. So they started a little skunkworks outfit, and they came up with this, the first transistor, in 1949. And this not only solved the burnout problem, it actually created great wealth in the United States and in the world, because the integrated circuit all comes from the transistor. And for the next 10 years, Bell Laboratories, 10 years to get the invention, the next 10 years after that, laid the groundwork for most of semiconductor physics in the world. Now, Davison, the first Nobel laureate at Bell Labs, this is Davison, this is his technician, Germer, he actually came to Bell, AT&T and Bell Laboratories to work on vacuum tubes during World War I, kind of liked the atmosphere of the place and stayed. While he was fiddling around with vacuum tubes, he discovered that the electrons, when scattered off a surface of metal, scattered as a wave. They Bragg scattered or Bragg reflected. And he got AT&T's first Nobel Prize. And now he becomes the great man of science, and it attracts more scientists. There was a young theorist who wanted to work for the great man Davison. His name is Bill Shockley. Bill Shockley comes to Bell Labs to work with Davison on vacuum tubes. Very applied stuff. And by then, the physicists said, this is really great, but why don't you work on part of our little skunkworks outfit? And so off he went and started working with others like Barty and Bertin. Believe it or not, the only experimentalists of these three people that shared the Nobel Prize for the invention of the transistors were Bertin. Shockley and Bardeen are theorists. Why is Shockley then sitting at the bench? Well, he was the department head. So, now the point here is you can be doing truly great Nobel Prize winning research, truly fundamental discoveries, but it's very mission driven. And if you look at some of, 15 scientists who worked at Bell Labs went on to get Nobel Prizes, which is remarkable because they always hired them very young. They weren't proven scientists. They were kids right out of graduate school and postdoc. But these are some of the technical achievements. And you look down the list, the transistor, the laser, satellite communications, information theory, the photovoltaic cell, digital signal processors, cellular phone technology. That's all came out of Bell Labs. So in addition to great science, there were some really good stuff. And so the point here, and in certain respects over the 75, 80 years that this was happening, some really great fundamental discoveries were made, but there was also a driven mission where they wanted to deliver some goods for the company. This is me before I became Secretary of Energy. When I joined AT&T, I was a graduate student postdoc at UC Berkeley. Then they made me an assistant professor, but it was a very weird little thing. They said, we like you, you can start your group, or you can take a 2-year leave of absence because you spent all your time here. So I said, that's great, I'll take the job, and I'll take a leave of absence, and I went to Bell. And during those late 70s, there were a bunch of us, about 40 of us, who were hired, young Turk scientists. About 2/3 of us in the National Academy of Sciences. 5 of us have Nobel Prizes. Again, we were all hired young, and we grew up together. And that's the kind of place it was. It was a very special place. And so the question is, Bell Labs is no more. What can be the new Bell Labs, and particularly for energy, or Lincoln Labs or Los Alamos? And so this is something that I want you guys to think very hard about. The national labs have an opportunity to step up to the plate. You can do things in national labs you cannot do in a university. So that's the challenge. The Environmental Molecular Science Laboratory here is a great opportunity. It was, as I understand it, it was established to look at the waste problem, but it's a much broader feat than that. And it's a great national facility. Think hard about using it and using all of the various diverse set of sciences. I'm not of the mind that each national laboratory should be a specialist in this and another one should be a specialist in that and everything. I actually like the idea that the national labs have a great diversity of science. But then the labs have to take advantage of that, because in a university, the curriculum and the admissions and all that stuff is stovepipe. And it's very hard to get around that. But in a national laboratory, you have an opportunity to not have those stovepipes. And we will, at least while I'm here in the Department of Energy, try to have it an opportunity so that we won't fund you into stovepipes. But look around and take full advantage of the fact that you have many, many things. So I'm going to end, and I apologize for going too long, but I just want to remind you of a picture taken on Apollo 8. This is the first mission that went to around the far side of the moon, and was taken Christmas Eve in 1968. And I want you to notice a couple of things. A very bleak lunar landscape, a very warm, inviting Earth, and mostly focus on the fact there's nowhere else to go. And, you know, Bill Anders, who took this photograph, said, we came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth. Now, since 1968, we have changed the destiny of the Earth, and we have to minimize that change. I want to remind you of a quote taken from Martin Luther King in 1967. He was actually talking about ending the Vietnam War, but it's much more appropriate for today. And he said, we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for those inspiring remarks, Dr. Chu. And I know the people in this audience really relate to virtually everything that you covered. We certainly relate to the issue of mission-oriented research and breaking down the stovepipes, things I think we do pretty well here at the laboratory. Now, I was going to open this up for questions, but in the interest of time, Dr. Chu's got a hard commitment at 6:30. We want to tell him about the work we're doing in carbon capture and sequestration and catalysis, and the work that we're doing to help bring along the smart grid, all relevant to topics we heard today. So we're going to end it here. And what I would ask is that if you all would just stay seated for a while till we make our way over to IMSL, that'll give us time to get on with the rest of our agenda. But let's thank Dr. Chu again for just an awe-inspiring discussion.